By the time the bell was understood to matter, it was already over. 3 men, all recognized instructors, had entered the ring expecting a public test. What followed lasted no more than 10 seconds. There were no dramatic strikes, no visible anger, no prolonged exchange. When it ended, the audience did not react at first. They were quiet, not because they were impressed, but because they were confused. Only later did witnesses begin to agree on one thing: they had just seen something decisive, and they did not fully understand how it happened. The ring was not impressive. It was raised only slightly from the floor, its ropes worn from use, its canvas marked by years of footwork rather than spectacle. This was not a championship venue, nor a place designed for history. It existed to serve a function, to contain movement, to define space, to give structure to confrontation. On most days, it did nothing more than that. The room around it was modest: folding chairs, a scattering of students, instructors, and onlookers who had come for routine demonstrations or informal challenges. No banners announced importance, no officials prepared statements. The air carried the neutral scent of sweat and resin, familiar to anyone who spent time in training halls. Nothing about the setting suggested that it would be remembered. The rules, such as they were understood rather than spoken. There would be no excessive force, no personal grudges. The encounter was framed as a test, of method, of control, of credibility. This was common in martial circles at the time. Styles were still defining themselves. Lineages overlapped, disagreed, competed quietly. When questions arose, they were often answered not through argument, but through demonstration. What made this moment different was not the existence of a challenge, but its shape. 3 black belts had agreed to step into the ring together. Each carried rank recognized within his own discipline. Each was accustomed to authority, to teaching others, to correcting mistakes, to being watched with a certain expectation of competence. Their presence was not aggressive. It was formal, almost procedural. This was how disputes over effectiveness were sometimes resolved. The structure of the ring suggested balance, equal footing, clear boundaries. An assumption that time would stretch long enough for skill to reveal itself gradually. That assumption mattered more than anyone realized. Bruce Lee had not asked for special conditions. He did not request altered rules, additional space, or private terms. He accepted the ring as it was, the boundaries as they stood. To observers, this appeared cooperative, even deferential. There was no visible effort to control the narrative before it began. Yet the ring, by its nature, favors those who understand space more than strength. Its limits expose inefficiency, its corners punish hesitation, its center rewards clarity of intention. Anyone who has spent enough time inside such a square knows that it does not tolerate confusion for long. The audience sensed none of this explicitly. They saw only a familiar environment preparing for an unfamiliar configuration. 3 against 1 was unusual, but not unprecedented. It was assumed that the exchange would be measured, perhaps extended, offering enough time for each participant to show composure. There was no announcement to mark the start, no dramatic pause. The ring did what it always did: it waited. In retrospect, witnesses would say that this was the last moment in which everyone shared the same expectations. Not because the rules changed, but because the meaning of the rules was about to be redefined, quietly and without explanation. The ring held its shape. The rules remained intact. What changed was the understanding of how little time they truly required. Before Bruce Lee stepped into the ring, his name had already taken its place. It moved through the room in fragments, spoken softly, implied rather than announced. Some recognized it immediately. Others knew it only as a reference, attached to stories that sounded precise but incomplete. There was no agreement on what exactly he represented. That uncertainty mattered. He was not yet a universal figure. To some, he was an instructor with unconventional ideas. To others, a skilled demonstrator whose approach appeared unorthodox, even dismissive of established forms. He did not belong clearly to one lineage, and that alone made him difficult to categorize. In martial communities built on hierarchy, ambiguity often invites testing. The 3 black belts carried a different kind of reputation. Each was associated with a defined system, a curriculum that could be traced, explained, certified. Their authority came from continuity. They taught techniques refined through repetition, passed down with minimal deviation. Their presence in the ring was an extension of that authority. It suggested stability. No one doubted their competence. They had students, they had years, they had credentials that could be displayed if necessary, though none were. Their confidence did not need performance, it existed already, reinforced by familiarity and the silent agreement of their peers. Bruce Lee's confidence appeared differently. It was not projected. It did not arrive with demonstration or assertion. He did not warm up publicly or rehearse movements to establish expectation. He stood apart from the center of attention, speaking little, observing more than participating in conversation. To some, this read as restraint. To others, it felt like distance. There was no visible tension between him and the challengers, no exchanged stares, no verbal sparring. When they acknowledged one another, it was brief and neutral. This was not personal, it was methodological. A question had been raised, and this was the chosen format for its response. What separated them most clearly was not skill, but orientation. The three black belts represented systems designed to be taught. Bruce Lee represented something harder to name, an approach still forming, still refining itself, unconcerned with presentation. Where their methods emphasized preservation of structure, his emphasized reduction. Witnesses would later note how little he seemed to occupy the room. He did not attempt to command attention. He did not correct assumptions. He allowed others to define the moment according to their expectations. In doing so, he placed the weight of interpretation entirely on what would happen next. The crowd, sensing a contrast it could not articulate, began to lean toward the familiar. Three recognized instructors suggested balance, even fairness. One man without a clearly defined category suggested risk, either his or theirs. Reputation, in that moment, functioned like an uneven scale. It leaned toward tradition, toward plurality, toward what could be counted and measured. Bruce Lee allowed it to lean that way. He made no effort to correct it. When he finally moved toward the ring, there was no shift in demeanor, no visible change in breath or posture. He entered as though reputation were something that arrived earlier, but left once action became necessary. Only later would witnesses understand that this too was part of the demonstration. The room did not fill quickly. People gathered in small increments, drawn less by announcement than by intuition. Word traveled without urgency, passed along in brief exchanges. Something was about to happen, and it might be worth observing. Those who arrived did not expect a spectacle. They expected clarification. Most stood rather than sat. They positioned themselves where sight lines were clean, close enough to see foot placement and hand movement, far enough to remain uninvolved. This was a habit learned over time. In informal challenges, distance allowed interpretation without responsibility. Conversations were restrained. No one debated loudly or placed open wagers. Instead, questions were framed quietly, almost academically. How would the exchange be structured? Would they take turns? Would it resemble sparring or something closer to demonstration? The uncertainty kept voices low. What unified the crowd was a shared sense that this was not routine. Three instructors entering together suggested intent. Bruce Lee's silence suggested confidence, or something that resembled it closely enough to be mistaken. Between those two impressions, tension formed, not dramatic, but persistent. There were no cameras positioned for record. If documentation existed, it was incidental. This mattered. Without the expectation of replay or public judgment, the moment remained internal to those present. Its meaning would depend entirely on memory. As the men took their positions, the room adjusted instinctively. Bodies shifted. Attention narrowed. The ring became the center not because it demanded focus, but because everything else receded. Even those who claimed indifference found themselves watching. The challengers stood with practiced alignment. They did not crowd one another or the center. Their spacing suggested coordination without choreography. They were prepared to respond, not to rush. This was consistent with their training and reinforced the assumption that time would be available. Bruce Lee's stance did not mirror theirs. It was neither formal nor casual, but efficient. He did not settle into a pose that signaled readiness. He stood as though movement were already underway even before it began. Someone near the edge of the room exhaled audibly. It was not fear or excitement, but recognition of imbalance that had not yet expressed itself. Others felt it without naming it. The silence deepened, not because the crowd had been instructed to quiet, but because speaking now felt unnecessary. No signal marked the beginning, no count, no gesture from an authority. The test emerged organically, as these moments often did. One movement would invite another. The structure would reveal itself through response. In that pause, brief, unremarkable, easily forgotten, expectation reached its peak. The crowd leaned not toward outcome but toward duration. They assumed there would be time to understand what they were seeing. That assumption, like several others in the room, would not survive the next few seconds. What followed did not announce itself. There was no surge forward, no audible shift in the room. Movement began the way it often does in close quarters, not as an action, but as a decision. Those closest to the ring would later disagree on who initiated it. That uncertainty was part of the point. The exchange unfolded too quickly to organize into sequences. There were no combinations to follow, no clear beginning and end to individual techniques. What occurred was a compression of intent, space closed, balance redirected, positions altered almost immediately upon contact. To call it a fight would suggest duration. This had very little. Bruce Lee did not advance aggressively. He adjusted. Each movement appeared to answer a question that had barely been asked. Where pressure appeared, it dissolved. Where an opening formed, it was not pursued for effect, only for resolution. The economy was striking, but not obvious in the moment. One of the black belts attempted to assert structure. It lasted less than a second. His footing changed, his alignment broken without force that could be easily identified. Another moved to compensate, instinctively stepping into what should have been support. Instead, he found himself displaced, his momentum redirected before it could stabilize. There were no dramatic falls. No one was thrown across the ring. Bodies moved, then stopped moving. The canvas did not echo with impact. The ropes did not shake. What changed was posture, how weight was carried, how intention withdrew. The third man hesitated. It was brief, but it was enough. In that pause, the encounter resolved itself, not through domination, but through recognition. The space no longer belonged to them in the way they had expected. Those watching struggled to describe what they had seen. Hands had moved, feet had shifted, contact had been made. Yet nothing aligned with familiar markers of success or failure. There was no visible escalation, no moment that invited applause or reaction. Then it was finished. Not because someone declared it so, but because nothing more needed to happen. The black belts did not regroup. Bruce Lee did not pursue. The ring returned to stillness almost immediately. The silence that followed was not reverent. It was analytical. People looked at one another, searching for confirmation that they had witnessed the same thing. Some nodded without speaking. Others frowned, replaying fragments in their minds, trying to reconstruct a sequence that resisted reconstruction. The entire exchange had lasted no more than 10 seconds, not timed, not measured, simply understood afterward, once the absence of continuation made duration irrelevant. What unsettled the room was not the speed, it was the lack of excess, the sense that nothing had been added for effect, and nothing had been withheld out of caution. What had occurred felt complete, even to those who could not explain why. In that moment, drama would have made it easier. Instead, restraint forced understanding to arrive slowly, long after the bodies in the ring had already returned to neutral. The first sign that something had shifted did not appear in the ring. It appeared in the way the challengers stood afterward. Their bodies were upright, uninjured, capable of movement. Yet the certainty with which they had entered the space did not return with them. One of the black belts adjusted his stance, then let it go. The motion served no purpose. It was habitual, a gesture made when structure had momentarily failed. Another looked toward the edge of the ring, not in search of instruction but orientation. as if the room itself might explain what had just occurred. No one spoke immediately. There was no need. The absence of sound allowed a different process to unfold. Understanding, when forced, tends to resist. Here, it arrived gradually, unevenly, without announcement. The challengers had expected resistance. They had prepared for effort, for adaptation, for the slow reveal of advantage. What they encountered instead was a collapse of expectation. Their techniques had not been countered so much as bypassed. The familiar sequence, initiation, response, escalation, had simply failed to materialize. This was not defeated in the conventional sense. No one had been overwhelmed. No one had absorbed visible punishment. Yet something fundamental had been removed, the assumption that their methods would produce predictable outcomes. Bruce Lee remained where he was. He did not watch the challenges for signs of acknowledgement. He did not wait for the concession. His posture suggested completion, not anticipation. Whatever question had been posed, it had already been answered to his satisfaction. The psychological effect became visible only in fragments, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a delayed breath, a hesitation where there should have been continuity. These were subtle signals, but to trained observers they were unmistakable. Confidence, once disrupted, does not announce its absence. It reveals itself through restraint, through choices not taken, through the quiet recognition that repetition will not restore what has been lost. The challengers did not request a second exchange. This was notable. In similar encounters, follow-up attempts were common, an effort to adjust, to reclaim footing through revision. Here, that impulse did not arise. Something about the first 10 seconds had suggested finality. The crowd began to understand before it reacted, not all at once, but through accumulation. A shared recognition that what had occurred was not an anomaly to be corrected, but a demonstration that rendered correction irrelevant. There was no humiliation in the room, only a recalibration. The black belts had not been diminished as individuals. Their systems, however, had been exposed to a form of efficiency they did not fully account for. Bruce Lee did not frame the moment as instruction. He offered no commentary, no explanation that might soften or sharpen its meaning. By withholding interpretation, he allowed each observer to confront the implications independently. In that restraint, the true imbalance revealed itself, not of strength or number, but of understanding. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The room did not return to noise. Instead, it settled into a quieter arrangement, as though sound itself were uncertain how to proceed. People shifted their weight, adjusted their clothing, performed small gestures of normalcy that did not quite fit the moment. The usual post-encounter reactions, discussion, comparison, evaluation, were postponed. No one stepped forward to declare an outcome. There was no authority assigned to do so, and no one volunteered. The absence of formal conclusion made the silence heavier, not lighter. Without a verdict, the event resisted closure. Bruce Lee exited the ring without ceremony. He did not look back. He did not wait for acknowledgement. His departure was unremarkable, almost easy to miss. Those who noticed it later described it as consistent with the exchange itself. Efficient, complete, unconcerned with reception. The challengers remained behind for a moment, not together, not aligned. They did not confer openly. Whatever assessment was taking place occurred internally, each man confronting his own interpretation. Their stillness was not confusion, but reconsideration. Gradually, the room resumed function. Someone moved a chair, another reached for water. These small acts carried disproportionate weight, signaling permission to return to ordinary time. Yet the rhythm had changed. The pace of movement slowed, as though everyone were navigating a space newly unfamiliar. When conversation finally emerged, it did so cautiously. Statements were tentative, framed as observations rather than conclusions. It was fast, hard to see. Not what I expected. No one attempted to summarize the exchange definitively. Language lagged behind experience. The lack of explanation became its own force. Without commentary from Bruce Lee, without justification from the challengers, the event remained open-ended. Each witness carried a version shaped by angle, proximity, and prior belief. None were complete, yet all shared a common absence. There had been no excess. That absence lingered. In the hours that followed, those present would replay fragments repeatedly, not in search of spectacle but coherence. The mind resisted the idea that something so decisive could leave so little visible trace. Some attempted to reconstruct technique, others focused on positioning, timing, and balance. A few abandoned analysis altogether, concluding only that what they had seen did not align with what they had been taught to expect. In this way, the moment extended itself beyond the room. It followed people home, into their own training spaces, into private reflection. The 10 seconds grew longer in memory, not because details were added, but because certainty had been removed. The silence had done its work. It had preserved the event from immediate distortion. Without applause, without argument, without official framing, it remained intact, unsettled, unresolved, and therefore durable. Only later would meaning begin to collect around it. The account did not spread quickly. It moved the way precise things often do, without urgency, carried by those who felt no need to embellish in training halls and private conversations. The incident was mentioned almost in passing, a reference, not a headline. Details shifted subtly with each retelling, not in outcome but in emphasis. One witness recalled the footwork, another remembered the spacing. Someone else insisted it was the stillness afterward that mattered most. No version claimed completeness. Each acknowledged gaps. What remained consistent was the restraint. No one described anger, force, or dominance. The absence of those elements became central to the story's credibility. Had it been dramatic, it might have been dismissed. Instead, its calmness made it difficult to challenge. The 3 black belts were rarely named in later accounts. This was not intentional erasure, but a natural consequence of the framing. The focus shifted away from individuals and toward method. The story was not about who lost, but about what had failed to assert itself. Bruce Lee's role in the narrative remained understated. He was not portrayed as triumphant or confrontational. He appeared as a presence that clarified something others had not yet resolved. The language used to describe him avoided superlatives. Witnesses spoke in terms of efficiency, inevitability, and quiet certainty. As the story reached other circles, it encountered skepticism. Those who had not been present asked for an explanation. How exactly had it happened? What technique had been used? Why had 3 trained men stopped? The answers disappointed those looking for formulas. There wasn't time, was a common response. Or, it didn't look like anything until it was done. These statements frustrated some listeners and intrigued others. The inability to extract a replicable sequence preserved the story's integrity. In some places, the account was tested indirectly. Instructors adjusted drills. Students were encouraged to question assumptions about distance and initiation. No one cited the incident formally, yet its influence could be traced through subtle shifts in training emphasis. The story gained weight not through repetition but through consequence. It altered conversations about efficiency. It complicated discussions about rank. It introduced the possibility that mastery might appear unremarkable, even disappointing when witnessed directly. Years later, those who had been present still spoke carefully about it, not out of secrecy but respect for its limitations. They understood that what they had seen could not be transmitted fully through words. The story traveled, but it did not multiply. It remained singular, resistant to expansion, anchored by the same 10 seconds that had first unsettled a quiet room. In that constraint, it endured. Time did not sharpen the incident. It softened its edges instead, removing anything that did not withstand repetition. What remained was not a tale of victory, but a reference point. Quiet, stable, and difficult to argue with. Years passed. Bruce Lee's name traveled farther than the room where the exchange had taken place. Films, interviews, demonstrations, and later interpretations introduced him to audiences who would never hear about that particular moment. Yet among those who trained seriously, the incident persisted as a kind of footnote, rarely cited, never emphasized, but remembered. It did not produce accolades. There was no record of the encounter in formal archives, no footage to analyze frame by frame. It was not taught as a lesson with steps to follow. Instructors did not build seminars around it. Its influence was quieter than that. What it changed was the tone of certain conversations. Questions about effectiveness began to shift away from accumulation of techniques, of ranks, of scenarios, and toward subtraction. What could be removed without losing function? What movements existed only because tradition expected them to? Those who had been present noticed this shift gradually. They recognized it not in declarations, but in omissions. Techniques abandoned, drills simplified, pauses shortened. The incident had not provided answers, but it had invalidated assumptions. Bruce Lee himself did not revisit the moment publicly. He did not use it as evidence or justification. When asked about challenges or demonstrations, he spoke in general terms about adaptability, directness, and the dangers of attachment. Those remarks gained attention later, but they were not framed around that day. The absence of a trophy mattered. There was nothing to point to, nothing to defend. Without a symbol of triumph, the incident resisted becoming doctrine. It remained an experience, not a rule. For the 3 black belts, the encounter did not define their careers. They continued to teach, to train, to refine. There was no public reckoning. Yet those who knew them observed subtle changes, less certainty in absolutes, more attention to transition and timing. The lesson had not been humiliated, it had unsettled. As the years accumulated, the story lost urgency but gained gravity. It became less about Bruce Lee and more about the conditions that allowed such a moment to occur. Public challenge, silent response, minimal demonstration, no explanation. Those who heard the story later often asked the same question: why did it matter? The witnesses rarely answered directly. They spoke instead about how rare it was to see something complete without being dramatic, how unusual it was to watch confidence dissolve without force, how unsettling it felt to realize that mastery might look ordinary when it appears. In that way, the incident became an instruction without a curriculum. It is taught by absence, by refusal to perform, by leaving interpretation unfinished. Long after the ring had been repurposed, long after the room itself had changed, the 10 seconds remained intact, not as spectacle, but as quiet proof that clarity does not need to announce itself. And for those who remembered, that was enough.